Jenny, what did you think were some of the challenges of working together across different disciplines?
I mean,
None whatsoever, right?
I think there were plenty, but I think it's a good thing. Like, I love a challenge.
I'm Dan Ho. I'm a professor here at the law school and study regulatory policy.
Hi, my name is Jenny Suckale. I'm an assistant professor in geophysics.
And we're working on trying to build out a modern toolkit to help agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, move from a reactive to a much more proactive posture. If you have water quality monitoring stations along the flow path of the water, how do we actually use that information to draw more informed inferences about the likely contributors to those pollutant spikes? And the goal of this project really has been to envision a future where we can take a bunch of sensor data that exists and is captured on a day-to-day basis and figure out how to actually inform environmental monitoring and environmental compliance going forward.
What stood out to me when Dan first introduced me to the idea was this concept of starting from a problem and assembling the pieces around that problem. And water clearly is a big problem. I think we can all agree on that.
Our team had been working with the EPA and a bunch of state partners really around trying to think about how can we bring in these different sources of data. And really quickly we realized that we were sort of in over our heads on some of the kind of pollutant transport side of things. And so that's when I reached out to Jenny at a birthday party, actually.
I know, yeah, maybe not the thing we should have talked about at a birthday party.
At a children's birthday party.
I think it's a terrible habit that scientists have. But it was fun, it was good, and yeah, I think it's, to me, really a very inspiring project. There's a lot of talk about big data, but I think the bigger challenge to me is often the small data. We only have measurements at like 3-4 locations along a river, but we have hundreds of potential farms contributing pollution along that river. So how do I connect those pieces? And that's where I think math comes in and modeling comes in.
One of the motivating examples for us, for instance, is you see these large toxic algal blooms appearing on a pretty regular basis in, say, Lake Erie. And the really hard part is how to take something like an event like this and figure out which are the facilities that might be responsible for this particular spike in pollutant levels. And that's been a hard part, actually, for getting the science right.
I think there's differences in language. I think there's differences in the pace of the project. Like, I think a lot of our more sort of traditionally science projects, they can be slow and it doesn't really matter, right? And you just take time to think about it.
Yeah, the time frame I thought was a really interesting one in terms of the underlying tension being, we could always incorporate more and more complexity into this model, and that would push the time frame back. But there was ultimately still a kind of endpoint because here was EPA trying to actually figure out how do we deliver this information to the actual kind of state enforcement officials. And even if it's not the perfect model, it's still a heck of a lot better than what our baseline might be. And just navigating that tension, I think, was a really interesting one throughout this project.
You see all of this intricacy on the other side, right? Like, I know the intricacy of the fluid dynamics, right? And the turbulent boundary layers and all of that, and the sediment transport and how hard all of that is. And that world so well, but I think there was this other world of like law, regulation, enforcement that I was just like not aware of the intricacies of that and all of the complexities that come with that. The way I see it is I observe the natural world and I have all of these pollution measurements and I'm just like, why aren't we better at getting those under control? And suddenly it makes sense, right? Like, why we're not better at that.
I knew embarrassingly little about pollutant transport and fluid dynamics going into this project. So there was every one of our team check-ins was a kind of constant translational exercise to try to really make sure we were both seeing eye to eye as to what the important problems were to solve.
That's what I most enjoy about this project or projects of this type. It really generates whole new questions. It's not like it just generates a new approach. It does that too, but I think more importantly, it generates a question that you never would have thought about asking in the absence of these kinds of discussions.